Welcome to this walk through Philippians 1, verses 28 to 30. We now finish the sentence that began back in verse 27. Paul has focused their attention on living as citizens in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. He's not referring to living as Roman citizens, but rather as citizens of the kingdom. As he'll say in Philippians 3:20, our politeuma, our state or commonwealth, is in heaven. Politeuma, a noun form, related to politeuesthe. In particular, he wants them to be unified so they can stand in one spirit. So stakete, stand in hene pneumati. He's going to unpack that unity shortly at the beginning of chapter 2. But for now he adds two participles to describe their activity in this unified and stable condition. First participle we saw last time, sunathleuntes, contending together, striving together for the faith of the gospel with one soul. And now we add the second half of his description with another participle, kaime peturomenoi, not being frightened. So our first section here says, kaime peturomenoi en meideni hupaton antikemenon. Okay, peturo, verb that means to frighten. Me and meideni, two negatives together, don't make a positive in Greek. It's just very negative. So not being frightened in nothing, or by nothing. Of course, we'd say not being frightened in anything. In classical authors, this verb peturo is used several times in contexts that talk about startled animals, especially horses. So the verb doesn't mean to startle a horse, but it paints a nice word picture. Now, antikemenon is from antikemai, to oppose or resist. Notice the lack of a linking vowel here, or a variable vowel. Those are also called thematic vowels. And since me verbs regularly lack them, me verbs are sometimes called athematic verbs. So this would be a athematic non-me verb then. And it's also middle preference. It's from antikemai. The participle serves here as a noun. We have an article with it, so it's either going to be a noun or an adjective. So by the opponents, or by those who are opposing you, understood. Paul's referred several forms of opposition in this letter, and there's more references to come as we go through. Here he probably has in mind the opposition from Gentiles. Hellerman in the B&H volume lists several arguments for that interpretation. The strongest one seems to me to be Paul's reference at the end of this sentence down here in verse 30 to his suffering in Philippi while he was with them, and you'll recall that was at the hands of Gentiles. So they're to live as citizens of heaven, and they're to stand firm and as a unified body contend for the faith of the gospel. In other words, the view of reality and the new way of life that's come in Jesus. And this activity is provoking resistance. So now Paul adds encouragement not to be startled, not to be spooked by this. He's going to go on to explain why and help them thereby to interpret their experience. So our next part, we have these double parentheses here. That's because in the SBL Greek New Testament that I'm using in this series, they have parentheses in their text. And since I use parentheses in scanning to set off like prepositional phrases and other small clusters, I just doubled that parenthesis to distinguish it from the ones that normally show up in these scans. So hatis is an indefinite relative pronoun. And what would it go back to? What would its antecedent be? Well, the only feminines that it might go back to, here's hatis, would be psyche or piste. That's the only thing you really have to work with back there. No, neither of those would make sense as the antecedent here. So it seems that this is feminine just because the word that it's going to go with, endexis, is feminine. So it's been attracted into that same gender. Now, what's it refer back to then? Well, Lightfoot takes it as referring to the participle that just came right before, peturomenoi. Your fearlessness when menaced with persecution is the way he puts that. Others like Fee and O'Brien and Hansen think it refers to the whole hati clause back into the previous verse. So they're standing firm in one spirit and contending for the gospel, as well as the opposition that it meets and their fearlessness. All of that would be what hatus here is referring back to. And I think that's along the right line. I think it's actually referring to the whole sentence all the way back up to the palituus there, since the hoti clause is unpacking something of what it means to live here on earth as a citizen of the commonwealth of heaven. So this hatus, the whole thing, they're living as citizens, which means standing firm in one spirit, contending together, not being fearful. All of that is what is now being referred back to here in this indefinite relative clause. The word indexis means demonstration or evidence. It's a pointer to something. You can compare the verb form endeichnumi, to point out or to show, or to prove or to manifest. So we have which is autois. We'll talk about that in a minute. Indexis, this evidence. Apoleias. Apoleias, an objective genitive, the object that's being pointed out. And what's the object? It's evidence or demonstration, or it's often translated sign or omen of destruction. Well, now whose destruction is Paul referring to? Hellerman, pages 82 and 83, follows Fee and O'Brien and Ruman and others in seeing the reference to the destruction of the Gentiles. In other words, all of this standing firm and so forth is a sign of these Gentiles' destruction. A few scholars, however, think Paul's referring rather to the Gentiles, thinking Christians are going to be destroyed. That doesn't really flow very naturally. You notice we have next, but of your salvation. So that contrast there is the most natural way to interpret that. And so this is probably referring to the destruction of the Gentiles, especially since the whole focus of the sentence is in helping the Philippians interpret their experience. And so that would fit with the more common interpretation here. So then what do we do with the autois? Well, if this is a sign of the destruction of these opponents, these Gentiles, then this would be a dative of disadvantage. The evidence is against them, which is a sign against them of destruction. It's a sign pointing against them to their destruction. So the point so far is that the Gentile opposition to the gospel is this sign or omen or evidence or indication to the Philippians of the Gentiles' destruction. Now, most interpreters take this as a reference to a coming destruction at the Last Judgment. And later in chapter 3, verse 19, Paul actually says of a different set of people, their end is destruction. Their telos is destruction, the same word here, which seems to be pointing more to the end time kind of judgment thing. On another level, however, this destruction could refer to their current condition. As Paul develops at length in Romans 1, outside of Christ, people are already under the wrath of God and living in a condition of death. And so now he goes on to refer to the believer's salvation, which has also already begun. So the reference may refer to a state of those who are in Christ and those who oppose him, whether now or later. In other words, the already and the not yet applies to both eschatological blessing and eschatological curse or danger. So we've got hatus esten autois indexis apoleias humon de soterias. And so I think the de here is best taken as adversative, and the contrast then is between the apoleia and the soteria. And the humon here is fronted. Usually the genitive will be after the word it modifies. So by putting it to the fore, there's a little bit of emphasis there. So it's a sign against them of their destruction, but of your salvation. So the presence of a community of God, citizens of the commonwealth of heaven, standing firm, united in spirit and soul, together contending for the faith of the gospel, that is, for the vision of reality revealed in Jesus, is a sign of salvation for those who have embraced the gospel, and a sign of destruction for those who are opposing God and the gospel and the community of God. We got dueling empires here, and God's is going to win. Our next little bit, kai tuta apa theu. Verbs omitted, and this is from God, or this comes from God. So what does the tuta here refer to? Well, from what follows, I take it as referring to life of citizens of the Commonwealth of Heaven, which includes this contest to contend for the gospel and the opposition that it meets. So I think the tuta here is referring to the whole thing that's going to be unpacked in this hoti clause. So moving on to verse 29, hoti humen echariste ta hyper Christou, monon ta eis auton pistuen alakai ta hyper autou paskein. So hoti is signaling that Paul's now going to explain what he means that this is from God. And the humen here is in an emphatic position, just like we saw with the humon up here. Pronouns help bring out the focus on these Philippian believers, and Paul's main concern here is to help them understand what they're experiencing. Echariste is from harizomai, to show favor, or to grant freely, to give freely. And then we have ta hyper Christou. The article is substantizing this prepositional phrase, and here it's serving as the subject of echariste. That which is for the sake of Christ has been granted to you folks. Now, while the article with a prepositional phrase is a very common construction, in this case what Paul has in mind is actually an infinitive modified by this prepositional phrase. So he begins the construction but then doesn't complete it immediately. Instead, he completes it by contrasting two infinitives with this oumonon alakai, not only but also. So in this way, echariste has two subjects. Ta eis auton pistuen, the in him to believe, so believing in him, but also ta hyper autou paskein, the for his sake to suffer, so suffering on his behalf or for his sake. So the believing in Christ was given to the Philippians, but also the suffering for him or on his behalf. Pistuo is used in a variety of constructions. When it's used with eis, there's going to be an emphasis on the idea of absolute trust, complete confidence, total commitment. Check out BDAG 2a beta in his article on pistuo. So what about the hyper here? Well, hyper sometimes gives the cause, translated because of, and in fact BDAG and CGEL, both of Danker's lexicons, and Abbott Smith all list this verse under that category. So because to you it was given on behalf of Christ not only to believe in him but also to suffer because of him, would be how they interpret that. And it's certainly true that the Philippians are suffering because of Christ, but I think more is in view here. Hyper is also used in another way as a marker indicating that an activity or event is in some entity's interest. So on behalf of, for the sake of someone or something, as you see from BDAG. So I think hyper here has this sense of on behalf of or for the sake of. There's something positive about this suffering. It's part of contending for the faith of the gospel. It's part of promoting Christ. Paul himself saw his ministry as filling up what is lacking in Christ's suffering. So you remember that amazing text over in Colossians 1:24, which I think is pointing to the fact that part of the job description of the Messiah was to take the light of the gospel to the Gentiles, and Christ is now doing that through his body, and the suffering that comes from that mission is part of the sufferings of Christ. And so in what follows, Paul tells the Philippians that their suffering is the same sort that Paul himself is going through, and all of this is hyper Christou. All of this is on behalf of Christ, for the sake of Christ, as part of fulfilling Christ's own mission. And so all of this, both the believing and the suffering, is a gracious gift from God sharing in Christ. And that points to God's sovereign providential care over the Philippians and over Paul. Then we move on to verse 30, ton auton agona echontes. In verse 27, at the beginning of this sentence, Paul used the verb sunathleo, to enter a contest, to contend along with, an athletic image, and now we have another athletic image here in agona. So agon, you see, is used in the sense of an athletic competition. Then it transfers to the moral and spiritual realm. So originally it meant a contest or a race. Then it can also mean now a struggle or a fight. Notice Hebrews 12:1, running the race that's set before us. Let us run the race that lies before us, the agona, the agon. So this is usually translated here something like struggle or fight, or even in the New Jerusalem Bible, the battle. But Paul uses military metaphors elsewhere, but here I think it's far more likely we have an athletic metaphor. He sees himself engaged in a contest. You recall over in Ephesians 6, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. There he uses the image of wrestlers. I value these athletic metaphors. Each day we're engaged in a contest. I often pray at the beginning of a day that I can play the game well today. I'm usually picturing like a chess game, because every move changes the board, so you have to be observant to each new situation and respond accordingly. So in the same way, things come to us as we go through a day, and we need the wisdom and strength and ability to respond faithfully. So engaged in a contest like this. We can also use the military imagery, and that certainly works too, but let's not lose the athletic imagery. So we could translate this line, playing the same game, having the same contest here. Playing the same game, that probably comes across as too trivializing, but perhaps engaged in the same contest. Now, echontes, this participle here, Hellerman on page 87 notes several comments indicating the difficulty of this participle. So let's take a look at this. So he says, semantically, echontes qualifies the infinitive paskein, giving the manner of the suffering. In other words, semantically, in terms of the meaning of it, but the syntax is irregular, what Moll in his idiom book calls a peculiar nominative, or an independent nominative in Porter. We might have expected the dative in agreement with humin, and so that's where I've placed it on the map, ton auton agona echontes, underneath the humin. And this is in the nominative, echontes. If that were in the dative, then it'd very, very clearly be going back up here to the humin, is Hellerman's point. So Paul likely had humes before his mind as the logical subject of the preceding clause, and cites Fee and O'Brien. One could conceivably connect echontes with stekete, back up in verse 27, in parallel to sunathluntes kai peturomenoi, and take hatis paskein in verse 28b to 29 as parenthetical. Paul's point is clear, though, and such attempts to smooth out the grammar are unnecessary. Well, in fact, that parenthetical interpretation Hellerman just referred to is exactly what the SBL Greek New Testament is doing, and they actually put parentheses in here. And so this echontes here could be placed here on the map, out on the left, in other words, in parallel with this participle, which is in parallel with this participle. So we'd had three participles: stand, contending together, not being fearful, having the same contest. Hellerman's point that we don't have to smooth out the grammar, and Paul's point is clear. Well, that's true, that's fine, but perhaps the grammar is smooth enough to begin with. Three participles here. The main difficulty is this participle seems so far removed from what it's going with up here because of this fairly long parentheses. But if it's part of this series of participles, then the distance is a little bit less. So we could see this sentence then as saying that their standing is a matter of contending together and not being frightened or startled, and being engaged in the same contest as Paul. The alternative is to see a parenthesis like this, but then the final participle is more loosely connected, moving from their experience to Paul's. And so, like Kellerman said, either way, the general drift of this is clear enough. That they, all this stuff that they're going through is the same athletic contest that Paul himself is engaged in. Hoion edita inamoi kai nun akuita inamoi, which you saw in me and now you hear in me. So hoion here from hoios, a relative pronoun, the same sort of contest which you saw in me. So they're engaged in the same sort of contest they saw, edita, arist, Paul engaged in while he was with them in Philippi and thrown in jail, you remember in Acts 16. And now they're hearing, present tense, that Paul is engaged in the same sort of contest because he's in jail once again, and once again for the sake of Christ. Now, Hadley Mole, not CFD Mole that Hellerman cited in his quote, but CFD Mole's uncle, Hadley, in his little commentary, makes the poignant note that one of the people hearing Paul's letter here in Philippi was likely to be that Philippian jailer. That was part of the drama that Paul's referring back to here. So Paul says this contest was seen in me, and now you hear it in me. All this is part of Christ being magnified in his body that he referred to earlier in the chapter. So that's a little walk through this particular section. There were some tricky bits in here with these infinitives and the question about this parenthesis. But the general flow of thought, you can see how it works, and presenting this amazing description of what it means to live as citizens of God's kingdom in the midst of the Roman Empire.